Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kara Heckert, and I'm the California Regional Director for American Farmland Trust. We are a national nonprofit and agricultural land trust dedicated to saving the land that sustains us through protecting farmland, promoting environmentally sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. AFT has worked across the United States to help communities realize their goals and give farmers a voice in the planning process. In more than 50 plans across the nation, AFT has helped different states and communities create the vision, roadmap, policies, and public investments needed to respond to market demand, support resilient food systems, balance the needs for renewable energy, and attract a diverse new generation of sustainable farmers and ranchers. In California, AFT has been instrumental in supporting research and sponsorship of several farmland protection programs, including the Sustainable Agricultural Land Conservation Program and California Farmland Conservancy Program. As a national agricultural land trust, AFT has developed a variety of resources for practitioners aimed at supporting their efforts to protect their local agricultural lands. As you all know, California is experiencing a long-term housing crisis with housing demand far outstripping supply. We also are losing 50,000 acres of farmland annually while also experiencing climate-related disasters that threaten our nation's food system and local community. It is vitally important to protect this farmland while growing California's cities effectively for the state's future and our nation's food supply. Often overlooked, farmland protection is a valuable tool for mitigating climate-related natural disasters such as flooding and wildfires. Urban sprawl not only increases greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution due to longer commutes, but this sprawl also encroaches on agricultural lands that both store carbon and sustain our economy. So we're here today to talk about the practical solutions and approaches that can help communities protect our agricultural land while promoting smart growth. Effective conservation of farmland is possible, and there are a variety of ways to do it. So today we have a great lineup, and we have several goals we're trying to achieve, which is not only showing you innovative multi-benefit local planning agricultural case studies, but also talking about resources for professionals to engage in local planning for agriculture and local and state policy approaches. So we have a great lineup today, first starting with the Director of Department of Conservation. Do we have David here? Just checking on our tech support. Are you there?
I'm here, yeah. Sorry, I was having technical problems. I seem to have resolved them, so let's
okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce you. Thank you for being with us, David. So David Shabazian is the Director of California Department of Conservation. So Governor Gavin Newsom appointed David Shabazian as the Director of the Department of Conservation in October 2019. Prior to his appointment, Director Shabazian had been Program Manager of Rural Urban Connection Strategy for the Sacramento Area Council of Governments since 2007, where he has also served as Project Manager of Water Resources and Floodplain Program Management since 2004. He was Deputy Project Manager for Blueprint Land Use Transportation Study at the Sacramento Area Council of Governments from 2000 to 2004, a postgraduate researcher at the University of California, Davis from 1996 to 2000, and a planner for the City of Davis from 1994 to 1996. So I wanted to welcome you, Director Shabazian. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll let you get started.
Great, thank you, Kara. So I was trying to think about how to talk about the subject matter at hand today, and I thought, you know, there's a lot of work that we've all been doing and trying to kind of contextualize that. I thought the best way to maybe do my presentation today is just kind of walk through some highlights that in my career that I think have, you know, really helped me understand and work toward these solutions that we're talking about today in terms of land use decision making. And the first, I think, really started with you know, my time at SACOG. When I first came on, I was actually doing urban planning. We were looking at the region's urban growth, and that being a driver for the sprawl and congestion that we were finding ourselves in, and really trying to find land use solutions to dealing with the congestion, the air quality impacts, and as well the impacts on our resources, and in particular the agricultural lands in the Central Valley around Sacramento. And so I think that that's actually a good place to start, just because, you know, the growth in California, you know, the AFT number is 50,000 acres lost a year per year to growth, urban growth, and, you know, a little bit of other sources, but, you know, mainly urban growth. You know, that's kind of a starting point for this, because that's a land use decision, and you know, that decision is being made in a vacuum for the most part, because mostly those considerations for resources are derived from mitigation of impacts on those resources, and not really thinking beyond that. That's been, you know, that's been our past, you know, 50 or plus years of planning have seen this tremendous amount of growth. And again, it was only, you know, since CEQA and NEPA that we actually considered the resource issues and the impacts on them as a component of thinking about our land use. And so, you know, I think that the work that we did at SACOG on the blueprint, which actually became the underpinning for SB 375 here in California, is you know, it's a good starting point for this conversation, because it's trying to keep that pressure off of our resource lands, which was a key component of the blueprint project. And while it was, you know, our main focus was really around transportation and trying to reduce the distance of travel or incentivize alternative modes of travel, and also provide housing that was more in line with kind of the life cycle of the demographics that we were seeing in Sacramento, meaning that we needed more housing that was scaled to, you know, a younger cohort coming into the workforce, and then we had plenty of housing for, you know, family formation and you know, that kind of that larger house, larger lot ideal that we have for raising families. But then once you're done with that, going back into the urban areas, and this is the trend that we were seeing, and going back into a smaller unit. So I think that, you know, I'm going long on this a little bit, because I think that's an important thing to have on the table, is that particular, you know, urban planning paradigm, you know, we recognize needed to shift for a number of reasons, and it's still an important component of land use planning in California, and particularly urban planning, is trying to find those efficiencies in how we arrange our urban areas, with the benefit then of as much as possible staying off of our rural areas. And so again, I mean, this has really kind of been the problem, which is, you know, particularly at a regional scale, regional planning hasn't been really regional planning. It's been urban planning, or a collection of urban places and planning for them. And then, you know, at the Council of Governments level that I was at, it's taking that and then fitting a transportation plan to that. And that's all well and good, that's important, but I think what we've been missing, particularly if you're doing regional planning, is the rest of the region, which in most of California, that's, you know, your region is probably 80% or more unbuilt and rural and resource lands. And so what are you going to do with that other 80%? And I think that, you know, that began the next project that I did at SACOG, which was the Rural Urban Connection Strategy project, to really think hard about, okay, well, what are we doing with the rest of the region? And that's a question that no one really ever asked, and certainly didn't answer well enough to call that a planning exercise, at least in my experience. And so, you know, that really then got me oriented, you know, pivoting from urban planning to rural planning. And then, you know, the name of the project itself, I think, was really important, because it's the Rural Urban Connection Strategy. So how are we really seeing ourselves as urban areas, as rural areas, and then collectively as a region? And, you know, what are those relationships and what are those dependencies? And, you know, as we kept digging in, we realized that one of the most important ways to look at this problem is to think about land use in a more generic sense of being economic development. And while there's, you know, the other values are clearly very important, the one that really resonates with everyone and that they understand is, what are the values, economic values that we're getting out of the landscape? How many people are we employing? And what are we doing going forward to enhance those values? And that became the driving question for us making a case for how rural areas add value to our region. And when we were able to start talking about it in economic terms, we also then were able to really get it linked up with what's happening in our urban areas and talk about economic development across the whole region and not just in our urban areas. So I think that was an important starting point for us, is to think about this more in terms of the economic equation and how things are linked up, and what are the services that we are also getting out of the landscape that we depend on, such as in the Sacramento region, flood control, but also water supply, food supply, timber supply, aggregate supply. These are all things that our urban areas depend on, and they're products and services that are being supplied by our rural areas. And so that's that connection that we were really trying to highlight and then put it into economic terms. So without going too long on that, I just wanted to kind of start there as a setup for my approach and my thinking about these questions about land use. And again, thinking about land use as in economic terms means we're thinking about land as a resource or as an asset. And then what are we going to do with that asset? Some people want to take that asset and turn it into homes or turn it into retail space. And some people want to take that asset and turn it into almond orchards, or they want to turn it into diversified farms, or they want to turn it into alfalfa production. It's their decisions about how to use that land, and kind of the highest and best use, or the most appropriate use, or the most practical use at that time. And really, it's about making money. And that's there's exceptions to that, obviously, but much of the land in California is being managed in ways to make money, and that's particularly true with agricultural land. And so if we can kind of look at it in that sense and find ways that we can explain to people that that land has value beyond being, say, just future urban, and that in fact we have a lot of dependence on that land for again, services and products and value that we all derive, both urban and rural communities. Now we can have a different conversation, and I think that was really the key point in RUCS that got the SACOG board at the time, and even still, thinking differently about what are we doing as a region, and how are we going to make decisions going forward, and what's the new information that we have on the table to help us understand our decision making and the impacts of that. And one of the things that we also brought to the table was not only kind of, again, these economic equations and land use arrangements and ways to do different scenarios to see what different futures may look like, and the challenges and the opportunities and the benefits and of those different scenarios, and then how to drive toward those, or how to avoid some of the challenges that we may be going into. So a component of that was also to think about the fiscal impacts of land use decision making. And I think this has been a big missing component of land use decision making, is when you're building out an urban area, what kind of benefit are you giving to the community? Obviously, housing, there's retail, there's a lot of things that you gain from that, but another thing you gain is the cost associated with now maintaining that community. The roads, the libraries, the schools, the fire, police, the infrastructure in the ground, that all creates a cost. And what we have been finding over the last, again, 50 years or so is that eventually those costs come home to roost, and the revenues don't seem to be keeping up with them. And so one of the metrics that we used was employing a fiscal model to see, are these really good land use decisions? If you build this subdivision, where are you going to land in 5, 10, 15 years in terms of the costs that you're incurring, and put that up against the revenues that you are generating from that development. And what we were able to show is that development patterns that are dense or more dense and mixed, and particularly when they're mixed, start to get you to revenue neutrality. And even in some extreme cases, and maybe they're not realistic scenarios, but we found a way to even have more revenue than costs from different urban growth patterns. So I think that that's also a really important way to think about land use. And it's one that's kind of been missing, because most often, a developer will say, well, of course, look, I'm going to employ some people, and you're going to get this nice shot in the arm from that development. And that may be true in the short term, but in the long term, that's where we really have to, do our roll up our sleeves and do our work on figuring out, does this really make sense? And I think that that's something that more and more is becoming important as we continue to see the cost of housing accelerate. How do we get more units on the market? That is through these more dense patterns, through infill and redevelopment. And then again, this is also helping keep pressure off of these lands and keep them in production. And I think that, again, these are things that haven't really prominently factored into our conversations about land use. So the other thing that I think is really important right now is that we're at a point in time where we're really coming to terms with the environment, how it's changing, and how we need our open spaces to help us kind of absorb those impacts. And I think that is where there's a lot of pardon the pun, ground to be gained in having this conversation about how we conserve our resources, how we utilize those resources going forward, and what is their role, and how do we use them to be adaptive to this changing climate, to be resilient, and to be sustainable. And again, it kind of I think the best way to really characterize this is, there are intrinsic values that are important, but what's their value in the marketplace? And I think more and more these days we're seeing that people are understanding that we need these systems to be working, these natural systems to be working better in order for us to really be resilient under these climate change conditions. And again, part of that, a big part of that is our food production, and what are we doing to make sure that we have sustainable food production going forward? That is land supply, but then the bigger context, I think, is then, well, it's also water supply, and it's also kind of these broader ecological systems and kind of green infrastructure that leads to the production of food. It leads to the production of timber and other forest products. And so if those systems are breaking down, then the products that we derive from them are also going to be harder to get. And so it's really understanding, well, what's the broader context for why conserving our resources is important, and what it is that we need to do going forward to make sure that we can do our best to maintain the quality of life that we have today, or maybe really what we're driving toward is to do better, and particularly doing better in the face of climate change and other other challenges that we're facing, particularly with our resources, is really where the Department of Conservation is driving toward to better understand that. So that's kind of leading me from my time at SACOG and doing the RUX project to now being at the Department of Conservation and bringing those ideas that I was working on at SACOG into the department, and then really merging that with the mission of the Department of Conservation, which is to conserve our resources and manage them for our benefit today, but also and equally as important, if not even maybe more important today, is really looking to the future and making sure that those resources are going to be there for future generations of Californians that we hope will have the same quality of life or better than we have today. And it's again kind of back to this connection. I mean, what is it that we are doing as a Department of Conservation, looking at our resource issues, but how do those manifest in our urban areas? And I wanted to toggle back to my SACOG experience because I think that there's some important lessons there. And this is just one example of a resource-based industry, but there are many that we work on. But it's that, in the food production and supply chain, you need these rural open lands to grow the food, and there's value there. But ironically, and I think importantly, there's actually more value in the food supply chain in our urban areas, because that's where we aggregate the food, that's where we process it, that's where we market it and sell it. And so, that's a really valuable, important industry. Yet you can't have that in California from at least from local sources if you don't have the land supply to support that whole industry. And what we found looking at these food systems in the Sacramento region is that, again, it was interesting that there's about 2 times the number of jobs in our urban areas related to food that there are in rural areas, and there's about 4 times the value. And so, when you start to get people to understand that that's a pretty important industry, and it creates a lot of jobs, and and again, it's a product that we depend on, but it really depends on our rural resources, and in this case, obviously, particularly our land supply. You start to help people understand the context for why this work is important. And then again, trying to broaden out and kind of open the aperture on agriculture, and agriculture needs water. So how do we get water supply? Well, it goes all the way up to the headwaters and starts to look at the issues of forest management and forest health, and how does that relate to water supply? How do you get that water supply down the hill and into reservoirs, or into canals and onto farmland? I mean, these all become the system that we need in place in order, and again, this green infrastructure in order for us to really, again, have the benefits of these resources going forward. So I think that's an important, again, theme here. And then also, really understanding that you can't do this without having good technical work underpinning these strategies. And that was an important component of what I was doing in the RUX program at SACOG, but also even more so today at the Department of Conservation. We are a science-driven department. We have, really great scientists who are good at collecting data and analyzing that and helping us understand, again, where we are today with our resources, and then what's possibly going to happen in the future, and how do we get ready for that. So that's always, a big important underpinning for the work that I want to be involved in. I think it's important for all of us to have good information going forward. Because we can't, make good arguments just based on ideology. We have to have information. We have to have data, and we have to be able to analyze that data in order for us to explain to people what it actually means, and then what are the implications of what we're finding. So, I wanted just to talk a little bit about what we're doing today at the department, and kind of reorienting our work to drive toward some key initiatives that the governor has laid out, and how those initiatives actually circle back to agriculture, because I think that's, it's important, again, to have this broader context for these resources, these resource lands, particularly agricultural lands, but that they're nested in a green infrastructure system that, kind of has to work all around in order for us to continue to enjoy the benefits of our agricultural land. So the first pillar that we're standing up is to look at watersheds, and we're calling this watershed management. I want to make clear we're not regulators of the water resources in California. That belongs to Department of Water Resources and the State Water Board. But we do a lot of work around managing our watersheds and making sure that they're functioning well and healthy. And so that's become a very important pillar for us, is to talk about our work in the context of watersheds. And obviously, we need water. And watersheds are not just waterways; they're all the land around them. And so, land use decision making is important to to really get us to understand how we maintain the health of these watersheds and the water that they produce. I know AFT has the no food, or no farms, no food, no future, and I would like to add to that, no water. So you start with no water, then you have no farms, no food, no future. So that's, again, that's one pillar that I think circles back to agriculture pretty clearly. Hazards, So we have the California Geological Survey. So, a lot of people think about hazards in our shop, as earthquakes and landslides and things like that. But also we deal with forestry and forest health. And so the wildfires are also a hazard that we're dealing with. And I've read plenty of articles about how the fires are affecting agriculture in California. And so again, that hazards pillar that we're working on circles back to agriculture. We're working on carbon neutrality for California by 2045, an initiative that was laid out by the governor, and as well his predecessor. And so we are trying to find all the ways that we can to reduce emissions. As Kara mentioned earlier, we want to reduce those emissions by trying to hem in the urban footprint. But then we also want to use our lands to sequester carbon. And we can do that in soil and vegetation. There's also opportunities to do it in deep geologic formations. But the key ones right now are really using our lands more at the surface to store that carbon as much and as long as we can. And then the fourth pillar is the one I've been talking about a lot today, which is the economic development opportunities, and really thinking about these resources as the starting point or the underpinning of a lot of really valuable supply chains, not just food, again, timber, aggregate, water, all of these things that we really depend on and are the basic underpinnings of our communities and our economy, that, really understanding the opportunity that we have with our resources in California. We're a very resource-rich state. Is a way for us to then show that value and why we should conserve and manage those resources going forward. So we have a lot of programs that really trend in this direction. The ones that I think are particularly important here are our agricultural land conservation programs. There's a few of them that really are a pretty important tool of buying these development rights and easements to keep this land open and in production. We also we work with the Strategic Growth Council to manage the Transformative Climate Communities Program, which is it's a source of funding to go to communities and help them envision themselves going forward in a more kind of holistic approach to bringing in things like infill and redevelopment and transit to make these communities, more viable, higher quality places to live going forward. So that's an important program that we're working on. And there's many others that the department employs to really, again, understand these resource issues, try to find ways to conserve our resources, try to, leverage and the economic value of those resources where it's appropriate to do so. And then, kind of taking a step up in state government and looking at all of this work that we're doing at the department in the context of what the governor laid out last year in his executive order for natural and working lands. And that is, all of the things that I just talked about that we're doing in the department are components of that. The one thing that we don't work on directly, but still have a benefit or, we add value to is the push toward biodiversity and the 30 by 30 effort that is included in that executive order. We are also a part of that, but I think that starts to contextualize our work in this executive order that the governor laid out, and that we're working with the Resources Agency and others to build the strategy around that executive order, and that we then will turn around and through our programs take the strategies in that executive order and go out and work with the local jurisdictions and NGOs that we work with today, and bringing again new resources and new programs and ideas through the executive order effort to help continue to drive our mission and to kind of expand the portfolio of work that we're bringing to a local level from the state. Again, using this executive order as a way to do that. So. I think I will stop there. I probably took up all of the time and then some that I had allotted to me, but I think we're going to do Q&A later, so I look forward to those questions.
Thank you so much, David. It's really great to have you be here today. And yeah, that is correct, that we're going to do the Q&A after our next speaker. And we already have a question for you in the queue. So just a reminder to the audience, to put your questions, submit your questions using the questions tab. You also got a reminder from our tech support, Beth Fraser, who's the manager of our National Ag Land Network. So next up, very happy to have our own Julia Friedgood, who is our National Director for Farms for a New Generation and Senior Advisor at American Farmland Trust. Julia is a national expert in farmland protection, agricultural viability, and food systems. She heads efforts to support the future of farming by increasing land access and supporting next generation farmers. She co-authored Cultivating the Next Generation, Resources and Policies to Help Beginning Farmers Succeed in Agriculture. A longtime member of the American Planning Association, she served on USDA's Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program Grant Review Board and USDA Secretary Vilsack's Land Tenure Advisory Committee. She's a founding member of North American Food Systems Network and serves on the advisory board and editorial committee of the Journal of Agricultural Food Systems and Community Development. So thanks again, Julia. I'm so happy to have you here. Take it away.
Thanks, Kara, and good morning, everybody. I always hate hearing my bio, so I apologize that you all had to suffer through that. It is an honor to be here. It is always a little bit daunting to follow somebody like David, who I've been following for a long time since he was doing inspirational work when he was at SACOG. But it's also great to hear where he's at today. And of course, all the way along, I just wanted to have a conversation with him. So I look forward to the panel after our presentation. So I'm going to talk about sort of AFT's sort of broad view, planning for agriculture and food systems, taking a national perspective, and then drilling down a little bit to give some examples kind of what I'm talking about broadly in places that we've worked, in communities where we've worked, and end with some emerging planning issues that I think will affect where we go from here. And I think I'll build a little bit on Kara's introduction, sort of given my role these days at AFT on sort of cultivating a new generation of farmers and ranchers, and lift up what I think we mean when we talk about planning for agriculture and the future of farming, and how that ties to our mission to save the land that sustains us. Because I think we really focus a lot on getting farming right before it's too late, because it's necessary for food production and because it's necessary to mitigate against climate change. So we take a holistic approach to addressing agriculture's major challenges, including the loss of irreplaceable farmland to poorly planned development, the destruction of topsoil and organic matter, which threaten our ability to grow food sustainably and provide essential environmental services, and then the demographic and economic realities that threaten future generations of farmers and ranchers and the food systems which depend on them. So when I think about planning for ag, and thinking a lot about actually what David said about sort of that rural-urban continuum, you know, the nice thing about agriculture is it spans that rural-urban continuum. If we think about changing farming now, we can think about how we then can successfully farm in the future. And communities have a really important role to play in that. So next slide. These days, I mean, I guess none of us can get away from thinking about COVID and the pandemic, but to me, it was a real wake-up call, especially about a year ago, or even a little more than a year ago, when people couldn't get eggs to die for Easter eggs, right? The pandemic really shed light on the vulnerabilities of our food and farming systems, and the fact that farmers, ranchers, and farm workers are essential service providers. Our dependency on overly consolidated markets, infrastructure, supply chains really leave our communities vulnerable to disruptions and shocks, which can disrupt our food supplies. Labor shortages, there were a whole lot of supply chain interruptions. In fact, we're still in the midst of a lot of supply chain interruptions due to COVID. Capacity problems all illuminated the strategic importance of agriculture and the need to increase local and regional food production and processing to decrease dependencies on extended supply chains in concentrated processing facilities, especially in meat packing. So state and local governments suddenly were faced with this need for better plans and policies to transform food systems for resiliency, and mostly they were unprepared. So even as we kind of deal with the repercussions of this crisis, it seems to me we really have to prepare for the next, and that's climate change, and that's already upon us. But transforming agriculture and protecting the land base which supports it are essential in that battle that we have to face and to the future of food security and climate resiliency. So that means we need to create new and improved systems which are more regenerative and holistic, so we can improve kind of ecological, social, and economic conditions, including abundant, healthy food, enhanced soil and biological life, thriving communities, economic opportunities for people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. And it doesn't mean tearing down the dominant systems, but it does mean that we need alternative and to some extent redundant systems so we can better respond to and recover from shocks and disruptions and ensure a safe and sufficient supply of food for everybody. But this is not easy, obviously. And as David said, a lot of times people, focus on urban planning or maybe transportation planning or housing planning, and we really have to take a much more systems approach and coordinated effort between public and private sectors, as well as all levels of government. So that brings me to the next slide, which is, the old adage, which is a failure to plan is a plan to fail. And I think of COVID really as the canary in the mine. You know this really well in California, and you've taken more steps in California to address it really than any place else. But climate change already is disrupting agriculture. Extreme weather events have increased dramatically in this century. You're faced with horrible drought and fires and sometimes floods. And then, I'm in the East Coast, we have flooding, we have sea level rise. We have new insect infestations. There are all kinds of things coming about because of climate change. And food crops, especially fruits and vegetables, are really sensitive to climatic stressors. And so when we think about everything together, we really need to think about, how agriculture plays in this sort of complex environment. California is so important. Again, I'm on the East Coast. I rely on you. In domestic and global food supplies, so that what happens, in California affects all of us. And yet, even in California, food insecurity is a problem. You have record numbers of Californians experiencing hunger. Farms, many of your farms, especially your smaller farms, struggle to stay viable against rising costs and global competition, especially cost of land. Diet-related diseases are cropping up and growing into epidemics. Nationally, obesity now, many people consider to be the leading health problem. So whatever kind of planning we're engaged with, whether it's urban or regional or environmental or transportation or resiliency planning or sustainability planning, or for us, planning for agriculture, it's important to take a holistic approach and to include food and ag, or if we're looking at food and ag, to include the other things that make up the fabric of society. So that means we have to plan for resilient systems, and we need to look at that broadly so that we can respond to and recover from stressors and adverse shocks, and still ensure a safe and sufficient food supply. And when I think about sort of what that means, sort of in food systems or ag systems, thinking broadly about resiliency, I think it means they're diversified, they're decentralized, they're flexible, they're renewable, they're designed to maintain the integrity of natural systems, but they also need to address the needs of all community members. So that includes farmers and ranchers, and not only the large profitable operations that a lot of policy supports, but also the small and underserved farmers and farm workers who typically are overlooked in, whether it's federal or state or local kind of policies. We saw with COVID that, it was often the small or the sort of mid-sized farmers who were best able to adapt to the crisis. And they jumped in and filled important gaps in the food supply. But given the economic pressures on them, they're really struggling to stay in business. So we have to really think about that economic element as well as the sort of environmental and land use element. But with good planning and public policy, we can support some so they have a better chance of survival and build in some of that redundancy into the food system. So, broadly, good planning helps create healthy communities. And we have to think about where we live, where we work, where we play, and how we move around, attract and retain thriving businesses and take care of the environment. And as part of that, we really need to plan for agriculture. So I guess that's sort of, where I end up is that it is the link between urban and rural. It is the link between economics and environment. It's the link between land and water. It's the link between many, many things. So next slide. So why plan for ag? and David touched on a lot of this, so I'll just kind of click them off really quickly. But certainly climate resiliency is one of them, and one that AFT is very focused on. And research that we did in California in a greener field study found that farmland converted to other uses emits greenhouse gases at a level 58 to 70 times greater than if it had been left in farming. So that's really important, right? If we manage our agricultural land well, it can help mitigate against climate change. It can sequester carbon in the soil, it can reduce water use, and so on. David also mentioned the sort of fiscal and economic impacts, right? So we at AFT over the years and other people have conducted what we call cost of community services studies. And I think there are like 150 or 175 now that have been conducted all across the country. And they have found that farmland, even when taxed at its current use, generates substantially more in local tax revenues than it demands back in public services. So that's an argument that we really need to keep in mind if we're thinking about the sort of long-term health and sustainability of our communities. Economic, especially in California, which is such a powerhouse, agriculture, just farm gate agriculture or cash receipts generated nearly $50 billion in 2018. That's a lot of money, especially coming from my part of the world. But it's not just the farm gate value, right? It's also all that production and processing, which David mentioned, when he said that there are twice as many jobs related to food in urban areas, 4 times the economic impact coming from the production and processing and all of those things, which represent nearly 3% of California's total GDP. These dollars get respent within, the local and regional economy. They bring additional value through multiplier effects. So that's really important to keep in mind when we think about, what does agriculture bring to the table? And then, of course, there's food security. And California leads the nation and the world in food production. You have a great climate, you have great natural resources, to grow crops and livestock, and you have great infrastructure and great people. We also have to, sort of recognize the threats and the challenges to those resources, but you're in a great position to lead. And then finally, there's renewable energy. And, this is sort of an emerging issue that I think people are paying more attention to, but if managed in a balanced way, renewable energy and farming can be a winning combination. Wind, solar, biomass can be harvested forever. It can give farmers long-term source of additional income. It can be used on the farm to replace other fuels or sold as a cash crop, and reduce pollution, global warming, and dependency on imported fuels. So these are just some of the reasons, they're cultural reasons, they're personal reasons, they're scenic views, they're shopping at farmers market, they're all those kinds of things. But it's really important, I think, to really plan proactively for agriculture and not just sort of leave it as, kind of a land use waiting around to be developed to higher and best use, whatever. So then big picture, next slide. Despite all the reasons that we should be planning for and celebrating our agriculture, our best lands are threatened everywhere, not just in California, and by poorly planned development. In California, you have extreme population pressure, which exacerbates this. But even in areas losing population, development is claiming some of their state's best farmland. So it's really a national issue. And this map comes from our Farms Under Threat research. Farms Under Threat is our multi-year initiative to document the status of and threats to America's agricultural land, and at the same time offering policy solutions to save that land. We partnered with an organization called Conservation Partners on the spatial analysis that led to this map, and we got a lot of data and support from NRCS. This map comes from a project, a piece of that project called The State of the States, which was the second in a series of Farms Under Threat reports. And SOS, as I like to call it, paints a striking picture of the threats that are facing working farms and ranchers in every state, and documents the steps states have taken to protect and to retain their ag land base for working farms and ranchers. So just to explain this map a little bit, we started by creating a model to map what we consider high quality farmland. That's a little bit beyond the usual sort of soil characterizations of prime, state, statewide important, unique, all those. But based on what we call PVR, which is productivity, versatility, and resiliency. And that underlies, that's sort of the baseline for this map. And areas that are above the median for PVR in each state are shown in either dark green for farmland or dark yellow for rangeland. And then we mapped conversion of farmland to two types of land use. One is the, the usual suspect, which is urban and highly developed land use. And those are the culprits that we're used to of residential, commercial, and industrial uses, largely found around cities and towns, but also includes some rural industrial and energy production sites. The second type is a new method that we developed for this project, and it's called low density residential land use, or we call it LDR. And we undertook this to help identify the impacts of large lot housing development and things like ranchettes or farmettes on the ag land base that aren't normally captured in that urban category using satellite imaging and so on. And LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions in rural areas where more and more individual homes are being built. And it's typically sort of scattered, fragmenting the agricultural land base and limiting production, marketing, and management options for the working farms and ranches that remain. The red areas show the combination of those two kinds of development on the map. And I'm going to zoom in a second and show you sort of how California fared. But, overall, even in a period of the Great Recession and, coming after 9/11, sort of two major kind of disruptions in development patterns in the 21st century, we found that from 2001 to 2016, across the country, we converted 11 million acres of agricultural land, which is equivalent to all of the land planted to fruits, nuts, and vegetables in 2017, or 2,000 acres a day paved over, built up, and converted to uses that threaten the future of agriculture. And we also found that this LDR, or low density residential development, was becoming the major threat. About 7 million acres of that 11 were developed to LDR, as opposed to 4 million converted to the urban and highly developed, suggesting that smart growth policies are working, but that we actually really need a new policy context to look at LDR in our rural and, kind of peri-urban and suburban areas. So next slide, we can zoom in a little bit on California, and this is a snapshot of how these patterns played out in your state. I do want to note that we relied on national data sets. So while it's consistent with your FMMP data, it's not identical. But, given our estimates over that 15-year period, California converted 466,000 acres. And then for perspective, we like to show how much land each state has protected permanently using ag conservation easements. And so that other number, that 775,000 acres protected with easements number, comes from a new project we're working on, which is a protected ag lands database, where we're tracking permanent farmland protection using sources including the National Conservation Easement Database and the Protected Areas Database, and then augmenting it with data collected from land trusts and state and local farmland protection programs. We actually believe this number undercounts California's protection efforts. So if there's anybody from a land trust in California that hasn't provided us with data, we would love to hear from you. So get in touch with me after the presentation, because we're constantly improving that database and we want it to be as accurate as possible. So next slide, in tandem with the spatial analyses, we conducted research on programs and policies that protect ag land, but also that look at supporting the viability and ensuring land is available for current and future generations of farmers and ranchers. And this resulted in what we call the Ag Land Protection Scorecard, where we analyze 6 programs and policies that are tied to the land and have been implemented in at least 10 states. And this kind of shows you how California fared in that analysis. We used a whole bunch of factors to measure program performance and highlight effective practices. And we do have like background score sheets if anybody really wants to delve into this. But sort of building up from this, we were able to come up with combined scores to give kind of a broad indicator of each state's policy response. And we hope that then will help raise awareness about effective approaches, inform new actions, and encourage more protection. You can see in the little matrix box at the bottom that California, had both a high conversion threat, but also a high response. And so, California then comes out as one of the leaders in this effort across the country. And just a couple of things to note if you're kind of focusing on some of the bar chart, is that the planning score does not include the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation or SALC program because it's so unique and there aren't 10 of them across the country. So I would say, really overall in planning, you do better than what this scorecard shows. And we did do like a little case study of SALC just to show that it's an exemplary program and one we hope other states will emulate. And then when it comes to permanent protection, part of what sort of dinged California is that the state only invested about 11 cents per capita per year in permanent protection, whereas the winner, which was Delaware, that earned the top score, was spending $6.03 per capita per year. Now, granted, Delaware is much smaller than any California county, so it's all relative. And I think that's what's important about this work, is to give people some guidance on sort of how they compare to other places, but also to recognize that every place is unique. So next slide, beyond the work we did in Farms Under Threat, but very tied to the work that I do now at AFT, another major threat that we're facing all across the country, but especially or including in California, is this impending transfer of ag land. If we look at, both producers who own land and non-operator landlords who own land, seniors age 65 and older own more than 40%, or about 370 million acres of American farmland, which means, that land is going to transfer, sometime in a normal planning process, whether that's 10 to 20 years, and we need to be prepared for that. In the past, really until this century, farmland usually transferred within a farm family, sort of the other old adage that I use a lot is through cradle, altar, or grave. But this is less and less true. And today, most producers don't inherit the land. More land is transferred between non-family members and family members, and access to land has become a major, major barrier to entry. Mostly starting out with small operations, beginning farmers face long odds given the farm consolidation that's happening all across the country, the appreciation of land values, the conversion of ag lands to development, and this very tight supply of land that's available to rent or buy. And so we're focused on that a lot. And when you dig into California, you see that there are nearly 6 times as many senior producers as young producers. And that's seniors age 65 and older versus juniors, so-called, under the age of 35. And when you look at principal producers, who are the people primarily responsible for decision-making on the farm, that goes up to over 8 times. So this is an issue, I think, that that David didn't actually mention, but I think is really important in the context of all of the other planning that goes on in California. Next slide. So we talk a lot about the need to plan for agriculture, you know, not just around it, and to actually add it into planning activities. This photo actually is not from California, but it's from Kentucky's Lexington-Fayette urban service boundary, which was the first one. It was created in 1958, actually, to limit suburban sprawl and patchwork development. And it's played a pivotal role since then in preserving agriculture in Fayette County, which is, you know, big bluegrass country, along with subsequent adoption of, they have a local purchase of development rights program to permanently protect farmland. And it's really a great example of what local governments can do, especially coordinating, you know, sort of municipal and county action to achieve shared goals.
Julia?
Yes.
Julia, I just wanted to, sorry to interrupt, but we are pretty much out of time.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Where do you want me to jump? Do you want me to jump to emerging issues or examples?
It is up to you, but I'd say I'm not sure how much longer we have the director, and so we need to go to Q&A pretty quickly here.
Okay, why don't we just jump ahead to emerging issues? How about, does that work?
Sure. Are you okay, Director Shabazian, for a few more minutes? Thank you.
All right, sorry about that.
No problem.
So there's sort of 4, and I'll try to hit them really fast, but within this broader context, clearly, you know, climate change is an emerging issue, and farmland can mitigate climate change by drawing down and storing atmospheric carbon dioxide in the soil. But working lands also are threatened by degradation from historical and common farming practices. And so I think it's really important for communities to address these threats by encouraging regenerative ag to build soil health and sequester carbon. Climate, you know, the climate action plans in California are a great example of innovations happening in this arena. And they may not necessarily be focused on ag, but they can incorporate ag. Colorado also has some innovations through their water board looking at this. So there's some really good examples of what local planning can do to encourage this transition to more regenerative ag. You know, since most conservation policy has really come from the federal level, I think it's a big step to think about how we do it locally, but I think it's really important. The next one, or the next 2 actually, I know are big issues in California. They're also really big issues where I am in Massachusetts. And one of those is regulating cannabis. So far, 34 states have legalized marijuana either for recreational use or medical. And it offers lots of market opportunities for farmers, but also is creating significant competition for land. So, you know, while during COVID, many retail industries failed, legalized cannabis went through the roof. Sales records, you know, sales just hit all kinds of records. So with farmland already in short supply, I'd say communities are ill prepared for this new green rush. And my understanding is that in California alone, you have at least 30 local jurisdictions that have cannabis-related initiatives on the ballot in 2021. So that's, I think, a trend we really need to pay attention to. And then there's siting solar on farms. And, you know, we're all for renewable energy. And yet, you know, that also can create a lot of competition for land. So there are opportunities, but there are threats. And so, you know, we really think that jurisdictions can exceed their solar energy goals on marginal and developed land without sacrificing our, you know, highest PVR or most productive farmland. So we're really advocating for smart solar siting to guide solar development onto land where it has the least impact on agriculture and the environment, and encourages compatibility with farming systems such as rotational grazing of livestock. And then I'll just end, with my sweet spot, which is the importance of transitioning the land, that's about to transition to a new generation of farmers and ranchers. And again, this is not an area where communities have done a lot of work to date. I was going to give an example of Lawrence, Douglas, Kansas, which has done some work in that space, but sort of referring back to that threat of that imminent transfer as much of 40% of our lands, we really have to figure out how we're going to get that new generation on. And there are a lot of things that communities can do, both with creating access to land, renting land, creating incubator programs, and so on, helping with zoning and permitting, looking at marketing opportunities. A lot of beginners are entering through local food markets, so helping them scale up will, not only doing farmers markets, but scaling up into institutional markets will really help. And then, ultimately incentivizing conservation practices. And with that, Kara, I will end. And I'm sorry if I went over my time.
That is okay. This is a dynamic process. Thank you so much. So we have a couple questions in the chat. Just a reminder to the audience that this is a really great opportunity to ask two experts in the field anything you might have. So a question for you, Director Shabazian, is how is the state positioned to support local planning agencies to take on some of these critical planning elements you've described to support and protect the natural and working lands and co-benefits of green infrastructure for great resiliency from climate in our communities? Quite a question.
Yeah, that's got a lot of components to it. So I'm going to start where I kind of left off, which is that the executive order for natural and working lands is a starting point for trying to coalesce many efforts across many agencies and departments in the state around one central strategy, which is the one that's being developed right now at the Natural Resources Agency, obviously with a lot of input from our our sister departments and agencies across state government, and also with a statewide effort at outreach through workshops to inform that process as well. So I think the starting point, that I see that's really evolving here is a state strategy for how to manage the natural and working lands that we have in California, and that being a starting point for really understanding how we balance that with our urban objectives. Clearly, we need housing in California, and there's plenty of efforts, particularly through Office of Planning and Research and Strategic Growth Council, to work on the inside game, I'll call it, of how do we plan for our communities to provide the housing and the services needed for Californians. So I think that at a high level, that there's ongoing efforts already for urban planning and supporting good urban planning. We have an evolving effort to coalesce all of the various efforts around our resources into one plan that then I think becomes, a way for us to think more holistically and simultaneously about the rural issues and the urban issues and try to strike that balance as we've been talking about. I think the other part is, understanding again, back to the economics. So Regions Rise Together is an effort that's been underway and started by the governor to really look across California and find opportunities, particularly in rural areas, to enhance economies. And I think, that was one of the big drivers of the REX project, was to look for these economic opportunities as reasons, for conserving that land and harnessing the assets that are there. And Regions Rise Together, I think, is a manifestation of that kind of REX idea, but writ large across the state of California. And on the backdrop of that is UC A&R study that came out a couple of years ago, showing that our natural and working lands produce at least $333 billion in value You know, and that's not counting the ecosystem services, the value of ecosystem services that our rural and resource lands provide. You know, that kind of coupled again with Regions Rise Together and now the executive order, you know, create these big rocks, so to speak, of you know, that we can put into place to get, you know, again, a more balanced approach to how we're thinking about our land use.
Great, thank you. Trying to navigate this. How about just 2 more minutes on the Q&A. I'm looking for any questions in the chat. Technology. I know we have another question, but I'm scrolling back very far up. Or if my organizers could repost the questions in the chat, that would be helpful. Question for Julia. Are there any specific first steps that you can recommend for an organization that wants to explore its own planning for agriculture program?
I wish I could get a little clarity. Does that mean there already is one? So when I think about planning for ag, I think of it not as a linear process, but kind of as a spiraling process. And so depending on where you are or where you start, it seems to me that if you're already engaged in it, then I would look at what metrics you have to judge your progress and adjust. So depending on whether you're hitting the goal, you know, if you start your planning process with, you know, community values, vision, and goals, and then you get down the road and you realize you're not getting there, you need to adjust, and then you sort of go back to the process of gathering input. And as David mentioned, I think, you know, having it really based in solid data and science and economic analysis is really important, and then using your metrics to judge that. So it really is iterative. So if you already have one, otherwise I would start with a community process to establish those shared values, vision, and goals.
Great.
Thank you. Kara, can I jump in on that question as well?
Absolutely.
Because I think, you know, I want to share with you a little anecdote from when we started RUX, which was I went into a room with a bunch of farmers, and I was advised not to put the words agriculture and planning together in the same sentence. And so that was, you know, that was 15 years ago. And I think that attitude has changed dramatically because I think, you know, farmers and, you know, other rural landowners have realized that if they don't plan, and if they don't, you know, get people to understand why planning for agricultural lands and you know, just natural resources generally, if we don't do that, you know, we're going to continue down this path to the point that we're not going to have, you know, the land supply that we need for production. We're not going to have, you know, farms, you know, farm viability insured. You know, the attitudes have changed, and I think that's an important thing to start with, is that the community, both the urban community and the rural community, need to be educated, and then you know, help them understand that we have to plan for this. We can't just hope that it happens. We actually have to plan. And you know, we plan our urban communities because we want them to look a certain way. We want them to feel a certain way and function a certain way. And we now have to do that for agriculture and our resources lands. We can't just hope that they, you know, continue to be maintained and conserved.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna do one more question for you, David, and then we're gonna wrap up this part of this session and go to our local innovative examples of local planning for ag. So for David, and you kind of answered this, but maybe just reiterate some of your points. How can community members, well, maybe you haven't tapped into this yet, how can community members support better land use planning in their region?
Well, I think that the key part is to understand. You know, a lot of what we do at the department is we work on education, we work on outreach, we work on helping people understand, you know, the basics of what it means to be, you know, living in California. You know, and that means that, you know, we're in, you know, more extreme drought periods. You know, our food supply or our food production is starting to get challenged. we're seeing more wildfires. I mean, they really have to understand that these things aren't one-offs. And so I think that that's, a really important start is to educate yourself. And that's, it's kind of a two-way street. We also have to do a better job, all of us, I think, reaching out to our communities and getting them to understand that those things that they depend on, the water coming out of their tap, the food on their table, the aggregate sitting under their roads and foundations that keep them stable, those are things that come from the rural parts of California, the resource lands of California, and that if those systems break down, their quality of life in their community is going to change. And I think that, just getting them to understand that they are, as all, great economies and societies have been, very dependent on resources for that quality of life. That I think is, something that we've been taking for granted, and we need to, go back and revisit the basics of what it means to have the communities that we have today.
Great. Well, thanks again so much. We do have a couple more questions roll in, but we are out of time and I need to go to our next speaker. So just want to thank you again, Director Shabazian, Julia. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we're going to move on to some really great local examples of local planning for agriculture. So our next speaker is Stephanie Anagnoson with Madera County. She's the Director of Water and Natural Resources for Madera County, where she serves as the county, Groundwater Sustainability Agency Manager, as well as Flood Control Manager. She has a background in urban water use as well as rural water use. So thanks so much for being here, Stephanie, and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And just want to make sure you can hear and see me, right?
That is correct.
Okay, good.
We got you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm Stephanie Anagnoson. I work for Madera County, and we have our own department, the Department of Water and Natural Resources. We are sort of parallel to our planning department and public works department, all grouped together on our third floor. So our department is tasked with working on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. We have a flood control agency as well, and then we work on a variety of upper and lower watershed health issues, including invasive plants like arundo, where you can see in the photo of the farmer with the really tall reed-like plants. We work a lot on those issues. And Madera County is located geographically in the center of California, precisely. We are an agricultural county. We have about $2 billion a year in ag value, almonds, milk, grapes, pistachios. Those are our top crops. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons our department was created was to really address the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and we have some significant hurdles. Counties under the act were made responsible for everywhere that didn't have other representation. So those are often called the white areas, meaning they're white on a map. So this is a map that shows Madera County's white areas. So you can see they are all over the place. They are actually in multiple subbasins between the Madera, Chowchilla and Delta Mendota subbasins. Some of them are little pockets of land in between the river and a water district. Others, as you can see on the eastern side, are just large swaths of mostly rangeland. When we look in terms of overdraft, Madera County has somewhere between 250 to 300,000 acre feet per year of overdraft. We are considered critically overdrafted and have really struggled with that. But I'm going to show you one of the programs that is a planning program to address the overdraft. Next slide, please. So we applied for the Department of Conservation's Strategic Agricultural Land Conservation, or SALC grant, and for planning. And what we proposed was a project that would identify criteria for kind of prioritizing land in a bunch of different categories: temporarily resting it, permanently retiring it, and even restoring it. So we proposed planning for that criteria and talking that through, as well as creating an incentive structure to do that. And so when we received the grant, what we did is we went out and created a process with a consultant team to walk through how to identify and prioritize land and create an incentive structure for it. Next slide, please. So we had a series of meetings with communications consultants and key stakeholder groups, the Farm Bureau, an additional grower group, Cattlemen's Association, as well as groups that advocate for disadvantaged communities, and as well as just key people in our community to talk through what they thought strategic agricultural land conservation might mean in terms of resting and retiring land. We spent a ton of time gathering GIS map layers and looking at that with the community at meetings. And then we've worked and shared out incentive structures for resting land, as well as a structure for rewarding for ecosystem services for lands that never went into production, but are providing significant value to the subbasins. So that's our 5-step process that we did with this grant, and I'll walk you through 2 parts of that in terms of costs. Next slide, please. So we call it SALC locally. That's the name for the grant at the state level, but we're calling it SALC here in Madera County as well. So we're acquiring water essentially from lands that enroll in it. We're essentially buying water savings from them because the land would be rested and not farmed. So what those costs look like, that's all in the table at the bottom. So we are divided by subbasins, and this is just the county GSA. None of the irrigation or water districts are participating in this. So the incentive payment for land resting, and this is per acre per year, comes out somewhere around $600 that a grower would be paid not to farm for that year. That number has resonated other places. I've heard that from 7th Standard, who has a similar land resting program in Kern County. So then everybody who is not in the program would need to pay into this pool of money. And so that comes in somewhere around $200. So you can see there are very, very hefty costs here of around $200 million per year that growers would have to pay to have this as a viable program, but it would do part of the work of getting us to sustainability. Other parts of that work come from really aggressive recharge programs, as well as buying as much water as we can possibly pay for. But there is a land resting, repurposing, and retirement component. And then my last slide looks at what I think is a little bit innovative. As I pointed out on the map of the white areas, we do have about 90,000 acres that are considered within our subbasin that are part of our groundwater sustainability agencies, but that are not currently farmed and may have never been farmed. So we've looked at ways to pay them for the ecosystem and habitat benefits that they bring. So we're currently looking at some of those acres receiving an incentive payment of somewhere between $25 to $100 per acre per year. So those are kind of what we've been able to do with this grant. It's really a number of programs that would have to go through a Proposition 218 proceeding successfully, meaning the growers would be asked if they want to pay for this, and then they would have to vote in favor of it, and a majority protest would obviously derail that, but that would be how we would fund it locally. And that concludes the slides that I have.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. And we already have a question for you in the chat, but we'll wait until after our next speaker. So thanks for your time. So our next speaker is Steve Maxie from Merced County. He's the Deputy Director of Planning. I think he's going to pop up here pretty quick. Steve, if you want to share your there you are. So he's the Deputy Director of Planning for Merced County, where he's responsible for the county's planning, housing, and water resources teams. He has 15 years of local government experience in planning and economic development with a passion for transportation and sustainability. Steve has previously worked on climate-focused projects for local governments and universities in California, and has recently focused on links between agriculture and sustainability that can benefit rural communities. So thanks so much for being here, Steve, and take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good morning, everyone. Nice to be here. Just quickly jumping in, wanted to give a little bit of an overview of what we do day to day as a Central Valley community here in California that places a pretty heavy emphasis on ag, and touch on some kind of day-to-day policy things that we are focused on as just kind of overarching planning goals, and then I'll touch a little bit on something a little bit more novel that we've been working on here more recently. And I apologize if I'm appearing pixelated. I'm not censoring myself or anything here. Just to start, give a little context of where we're at location-wise. We are actually Madera County neighbor to the north, so just right next door to Stephanie, our last speaker. We're about 2 hours from San Francisco, Sacramento, Pacific Ocean, Yosemite. So we're also pretty much right in the middle of the state here. Our population is just shy of about 300,000 people, the bulk of which are employed or focused on supporting the ag sector here in the community. From an ag standpoint, about 95% of our total land area countywide is focused on or is dedicated to natural and working land, and that results in a gross, at least as of 2019, of about $3.1 billion from our ag sector. Our biggest producers are milk, almonds, cattle, chicken, and sweet potatoes, but the remainder of kind of what I show on the map there is not that far behind. We're also home to the Grasslands Ecological Area, which is kind of the big vacant area in the middle of the map on the right there. It's about 240,000 acres. It's the largest remaining wetland complex in the Western United States, and so a pretty big working land for us, and a big partner for us in a lot of land use decisions that we make. If we go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about how significant ag is as a component of what we do and what our identity is here in Merced. Just an idea of what we or how we've involved ag in our planning policies. Here in California, we have a requirement to prepare a general plan, which is really the foundation of our local land use planning. It's our vision for what we see in our foreseeable planning horizon. So looking out 20 plus years, we line out a number of objectives for county planning policy, various goals that we want to try to hit as a community, and then establish specific policies based on those goals. So to get to one of Director Shabazian's points earlier, if you put ag and planning together in this kind of decision-making process, you're going to wind up with a lot of ag-centric policies. And in our case, that manifests itself as an agricultural element or a chapter of our general plan that is really above and beyond the requirements of what we need to do to satisfy our state requirements for a general plan. So what I'm showing here, just looking at some of these goals that are listed, it's not just in our agricultural element, but even in our land use and economic development elements. It's really in the fabric of our general plan that we put a lot of these ag policies in place, and it drives so much of what we do from a land use and economic development perspective in my department here. In addition to what's just in our general plan, we also have a right to farm ordinance that places a heavy emphasis on ag and the rights that farmers have to continue to operate their agricultural uses in a manner that's supportive of ag. We have established an agricultural lands mitigation program that requires conservation of ag land when ag land is converted or potentially impacted. And we really push to advocate that program for support with local cities that maybe don't have the same policy in place, but might have similar impacts on our agricultural community. And then we also have a pretty heavy focus on what happens at the boundary or the interface of our ag and urban uses countywide, what buffering requirements would look like from urban uses to agricultural uses to, again, limit the impact on ag. So jumping into the next slide, what all this focus on ag and our planning policy means for me as county staff, really charged with making sure that that I implement these goals and objectives that are in our general plan and our other planning policies, is that I can get involved in things that push the envelope a little bit and try something new. And so I wanted to highlight, just as a case study here, the Resilient Merced project and the resulting tool called TerraCount. This was a project that we partnered with the Nature Conservancy on as kind of the lead, and this was funded by the Department of Conservation here in the state of California. And the goal here was to develop a tool that could look at the links between land management practices, conservation, planning for conservation, and what could be greenhouse gas reduction benefit in the long term. So Merced, given our good variety of land use and I think our variety of natural and working lands as a whole, I was selected as a candidate for the pilot program. We worked with, again, DOC and the Nature Conservancy to put this tool and this guide, this Resilient Merced guide together. And this is now an existing and published tool that is available for other agencies or jurisdictions to use. The tool itself measures the greenhouse gas benefits from land management activities, and it also looks at other co-benefits. So I can touch on that in a moment. But it's really intended as kind of this decision support tool as you go through formulating your own land management activities. If you're say a district or just a land management agency, or if you're going through planning exercises as a land use agency, what that would mean, what different scenarios or different opportunities for land management could look like as just options for your decision makers. So into the next slide, please. Again, this was developed to be usable by counties, cities, special districts, and other land management agencies. You start off by modeling your greenhouse gas, you take an inventory of your current land cover. You can look at some other specific inputs that are maybe more focused on what you're doing as a land management agency. And then you can use this tool, which is a spatial tool, GIS tool, to run models based on what could be expected activities that would take place to increase ultimately landscape carbon storage. And so you can take these modeled scenarios and use them as a basis for, again, making those planning or policy decisions, informing your decision makers, whether that's electeds or the folks that are actually doing the day-to-day or making the day-to-day land use decisions. On the left side there, one thing I wanted to touch on and what was particularly interesting to me as a land use planner is the tool also measures a lot of these co-benefits. So things like groundwater recharge potential, as Stephanie just touched on, are very huge and very forthcoming or upcoming rather issues that we're having to deal with from a land use standpoint. And so having a tool that not only can look at different models or different scenarios for conservation or land management activities, but can also model and quantify some of these co-benefits is really, really valuable. And I think that goes beyond just a land use thought process. If you're, for example, a wildlife management area and you're considering two different scenarios, and say one's a clear winner in biodiversity as a co-benefit, but it's also a clear winner in maybe your ability for carbon storage, then it's kind of a no-brainer at that point on what makes more sense to try to enact or carry forward from a policy standpoint. On the next slide, please, what this tool has done for us, or where we're at now. I should mention it's just a couple years old at this point, and I believe 2 other counties in the state have moved on to start their own process of doing their inventory and their scenario planning. But for us at the local level, and what it could do for others is really prior to the project, there was no means that we had to quantify greenhouse gas emissions of our land use decisions as they pertain to the management and the conservation of working lands. And now with this tool, we can fold it into our policy and our planning work to help add another option or another consideration point for our community to consider, and for our decision makers to consider. Locally, just the example that I just gave, I know our grasslands wildlife management area can and has considered looking at using that tool to inform their management activities, which again, this we can now kind of blend. How can the county support the management activities of grasslands through policy? So there are just some real benefits there that we're able to take advantage of. At the community level, we've been able to, or we hope to be able to use this tool to target the types of incentives that our landowners, our farmers want to see, that maybe can support different land management activities, or can lead to greater ag conservation. And then we can also quantify a lot of the community health or the co-benefits that are associated with different scenarios. From a county policy standpoint, we've already looked at folding in some of the inventory work that was completed for the Resilient Merced project into our upcoming climate action plan. That kind of gives rise to the question of how ag might be folded into our climate action plan. And this is a pretty clear-cut way, science-based and very targeted way to fold ag in to our climate action plan. With our existing agricultural lands mitigation program, this could, maybe be another tool to help target where we'd want to see that type of conservation or ag land conservation or avoided conversion. And then folding this in again as a decision support tool for our general plan and our various community plans, our urban community plans countywide. And then I know at the state level too, just being engaged with some folks at the state level that are working on various opportunities to potentially use this tool to fold it into funding sources, or maybe use it as a reporting tool on the back end of some programs like SALC. Just we know that there's a lot of upcoming uses for this terra count tool that we're excited to kind of keep an eye on and see what happens. My last real slide here, looking at future policy and planning issues that I think will affect both the urban side of what I do and the ag side of what I do. Groundwater management, as Stephanie just touched on, is going to be such a huge piece of what we do for the next decade plus. With SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, what's that going to mean for both our ag and urban uses, and how is the county here going to have to balance that, again, as Director Shabazian talked about, that balance between economic development and maybe the intrinsic value of our ag land and our natural working lands. And one piece of that groundwater management is going to be, we have this continued housing pressure. We need to see more housing develop as a state. There's an intense pressure from our state governments that's being placed heavier and heavier on the local agencies to meet this demand for housing, but we're being told to do more with less, as always, right? So we've got fewer resources, we've got less groundwater to work with that really supports a lot of these rural communities that are dependent on groundwater. but we have to realize there's a lot of give and take for what that's going to mean for our ag community as well. And then finally, just folding the ag sector into our climate action plan, whether that's something that we really want to see happen, you know, and at what scale. There's some state legislation and case law just recently that's driving how or even whether that ag gets folded into our climate action planning or sustainability planning overall. Or, you know, regional air quality planning, things like that. So there are just some few things that we're keeping our fingers on the pulse of, because again, we understand the importance of ag to our community and to just everybody's well-being as a whole. So that concludes what I've got to say, but definitely welcome any questions, and would welcome any contact from anybody that's looking at similar issues.
Thank you so much, Steve. I think we're going to go right into the Q&A. And so we're going to have Stephanie join, as well as Katie Patterson, AFT's California Policy Manager. Thanks for joining us, Katie. And she is going to do the Q&A. She's been monitoring it for the next several minutes.
Great. Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much, Stephanie and Steve, for joining us. Really great conversations today. We're excited that there's still some of you out there hanging on and able to maintain 2 hours with us on this important topic. You know, we've really gone through some very national high-level issues, and now we've drilled down to a really localized place. And so I'm excited to pass on some of these questions for you all here. So this one I'm going to tag to Stephanie, and it's just really wanting to expand upon, you know, what you felt were some of the most challenging aspects of program implementation thus far, and any opportunities and advice that you have for other jurisdictions that are considering these similar programs. What's some of the advice that you would give them?
Sure. I think the most challenging part is really still to come. We need to find a funding source, and we need to go through Proposition 218, and that is no one's idea of a good time. So people are very interested in being paid. They're not so interested in paying, and I think sometimes that there's a really big disconnect there, where they think this is some, you know, free pot of money to pay them. And so I think the biggest piece of advice is just making sure that connection is really, really clear to people. And so we've tried different graphs and charts to make it clear that we're all paying into a pot, and then the pot could pay you. But that would be my big piece of advice. Great,
thank you. And then this one's kind of set up for both of you here. In terms of, you know, what role your elected officials play in the adoption and the ability for you as planning agencies to really engage in these innovative activities. You guys want to share your experience?
Sure, I can touch on that a little bit. In my case, anyway, my elected officials on the Board of Supervisors here, I'll say 4 of the 5 of them come from an ag family or an ag background, or have farmed themselves, and so we have a very very supportive elected body here of these innovative activities, as long as there's a benefit to what Stephanie just touched on. You know, how can this help our farming community in the long run? So there's absolutely some support here on my side of things.
Great. Stephanie?
Well, just to piggyback on what Steve said, we do answer to a board of supervisors as well. And what I have found is that keeping them in continuous conversation on topics related to SGMA, and we give monthly updates, you know, regardless if there's good news or bad news or any news, we give an update so that they're plugged into that process. They are very supportive of agriculture, but they really want to be well informed about what's going on.
Yeah, so constant update sounds like a good key theme there. Stephanie, there's this really specific question, right? You got into the nitty-gritties of Prop 218 and how challenging those can be. It's a very California specific election. This question is, have you done any survey work to understand the potential viability of a 218 election cycle?
We haven't done surveys in terms of like asking people whether they would vote for something. We are going to do what would amount to kind of focus groups as we get closer in and share out costs. And the Farm Bureau has been really helpful in kind of gauging people's pulse. I guess my concern isn't that the number is really the issue with a Proposition 218. It's just that there's a sense that people in ag are very fed up with regulation. And when asked whether they want to pay more, a very reasonable answer could be no. And I get that. And so I think that's really what we struggle with.
Yeah, that is a challenge. When folks feel like it's coming from a lot of different directions, and to be able to understand, how this isn't a shared interest for sure. Steve, I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more. You were kind of touching on some of the pieces of your ag element and the general plan functions. And I was wondering if you could just kind of outline very briefly what the ag mitigation program in Merced County looks like. And is that a ratio? Is it a fee-based? I think maybe sharing a little bit of that structure might help.
Sure. Yeah. So that actually was a policy or an ordinance that came into place as a result of a general plan goal. So for us, it is a ratio. So if you're going to convert what we consider important farmland, and it's as mapped on our FMP map. So if you meet some of the highest importance farmland on that map, I think we go from prime all the way down to unique. If any of that's converted or developed, then it is a ratio of 1 to 1, so 1 acre to 1 acre that needs to be placed under conservation, ideally somewhere within the county, but it has to be a matching quality of farmland. So, in some cases we're able to find that land or work with a developer to find that land here. In the case that we're not, we are able to work with some other local farmland trusts. In this case, California Farmland Trust is a pretty heavy partner with us to support other maybe larger easements that they're considering or working on, both in and out of the county. But in general, we try to stick to, at a minimum, something that's here in the valley.
Yeah. So I want to switch because this is really, really great, right? It's about wisdom. And wondering if either of you could impart some of your wisdom in terms of how you have successfully collaborated with your local cities to balance urban and ag and natural resource demands. Anyone want to share your secret bag of tricks there and in collaboration? Oh, it's proprietary, huh?
Yeah, it's difficult, right? There's an inherent difference of opinion in cities that, especially here in California, growth is kind of life. It's a way that a lot of things are funded, via these impact fees that cities are so dependent on. And so balancing, or finding those creative opportunities to work with cities on the front end of a lot of their planning policies, their general plans, even to when they're defining a lot of their boundaries early on in a lot of their larger planning processes is really, really important. We have a pretty talented staff here that get engaged in a lot of projects from the get-go, even smaller city development projects. And we have, for better or for worse, we have that magic tool of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, right? So that we have an opportunity to make a lot of the comments that we want to make that are focused on ag. So we have the carrot and trying to work with a lot of these cities on trying to come up with something creative, but we also have the stick that's CEQA at the end of the day too.
Yeah. And Stephanie, we're going to boomerang back real quick. Maybe you can explain a little bit more on what the Prop 218 issue is. I understand it from, my county days as well, but just, a quick thumbnail on what it is and why it's challenging maybe for local jurisdictions to engage in.
Sure. So Proposition 218 is essentially a taxpayer protection law. So it means that if you are going to tax people, they have to vote for it. And it's typically done as a majority protest which will overrule it. So if the majority of people vote against it, you can't do whatever the tax is. And the twist here is that the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act says that if a groundwater sustainability agency wants to build a project, whether it's a recharge basin or paying people not to farm, that has to go through Prop 218. So I think that's, it's sort of a strength and a weakness. It's good that people have to vote for it and know what they are paying for, but it does make it anxiety producing for me, and it introduces some vulnerability in whether or not we will be able to do projects because they need people to vote for them and essentially vote to tax themselves. And Steve,
and those are fairly expensive processes to undertake, aren't they?
Yes. So from a water rates point of view, you have to hire a water rate consultant. They specialize in this. They're going to do some modeling about how keeping your rate consistent and what exactly could happen under different scenarios. And then they'll mail out ballots and count them. So it's probably a, $200,000-$300,000 process. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to undertake it unless you think you're going to be successful in the end.
Yeah. Steve, any last thoughts on that before we wrap here?
No, just thank you again for having me today, and again, welcome any chances to dialogue with anybody in the audience today as well.
Yeah, thank you both Stephanie and Steve, for joining us. I'm going to throw it back over to Kara, and we're going to move on to our last speaker for the session. Thanks.
Great, thanks again. We know we have a lot of people attending this webinar that also are part of really great local examples, and we really hope to have a webinar like this every year. But I want to get to our last speaker and encourage everyone to hang on for 10 more minutes. We have Chris Coffin, who's our National Ag Land Network Director and Senior Policy Advisor for AFT. Chris brings decades of federal and state policy experience along with coalition development and food system planning to her current roles at AFT. She is a veteran of 6 federal farm bills and numerous state policy campaigns with a policy focus on farmland retention and protection, land access, and farm transfer and succession. An attorney, Chris has served as professional staff on the U.S. Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, and as legislative assistant and chief of staff to U.S. Senator Herb Kohl. Chris helped to found and now co-chairs the Massachusetts Food System Collaborative. Chris is going to talk to us about AFT's National Ag Land Network. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Kara. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
And I would just say to everybody, you don't even need to hang on for 10 minutes because I won't take all that amount of time, but I did want to just talk for a minute about the National Agricultural Land Network. And I want to say at the outset, I am very happy that the network was a co-host of this webinar, and we hope to continue to work with our California office to do more of this kind of programming. And I learned a significant amount from the presentation, so thank you to all the presenters. Very quickly, the National Agricultural Land Network is a professional network. It is formalizing a role that American Farmland Trust has played since our founding that is focused on peer networking and information sharing around agricultural land protection practitioners. But in creating the network, we realized a couple of things. Saving agricultural land is really a continuum. So as we talked about today, it really is from the planning and zoning perspective, moving to what are those interim protections that might be term easements or non-development covenants, to permanent protection of farm and ranch land. So we wanted to think about this network of the people who run the gamut of those types of focus on saving American farmland. The second thing is that we wanted to take, as both David and Julia talked about, as sort of more of a systems approach and thinking about it in terms of what are the connections between that agricultural land retention and protection to climate change and encouraging more resilient practices on our agricultural land. What is the connection between saving land and land access? What are the opportunities to think about farm transfer and access as we think about saving farm and ranch land? So it's really, it's what we think about as farmland protection plus. It's what are all these connections that we can make? So we are hoping that this network is an opportunity to bring together and to encourage learning from each other about the many innovative things, such as we learned about today, that are happening around the country. So as you'll see from this next slide, we're a relatively young network. We just started formally last year. This is sort of where we have members. Membership is free. So if there's folks on this webinar who are not yet members, our fabulous network manager, Beth Fraser, I think if we can put the link to the sign up form on the AFT website in the questions or the chat, we will do that. Otherwise, you can go to the AFT website, farmland.org, and find more information there. It is free. You can join as an organization or as an individual. So next slide. Looking at the services and products that the network is offering. This is a sort of list of them. We have done some webinars. We've done them around Buy, Protect, Sell, which is a form of permanent farmland protection. We've done some on our Farms Under Threat State of the States report that Julia mentioned earlier. There are resources in there in our Farmland Information Center under the Federal Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, and we are looking to do more workshops that are particularly policy focused. But I want to take just a minute to talk about these last three that are here. So on the next slide, you'll see that we see doing regional and state specific roundtables as a way to encourage peer networking. We actually started California, not surprisingly, because you all are trail blazers in so many ways. We did our first roundtable in California. It was the summer of 2019, and we brought together particularly folks who are focused on farmland protection. We would love to do more. We would love to do roundtables that are focused on, again, planning and thinking about planning for agriculture. You see these other roundtables that we are doing as well. The next slide talks a little bit about the network that we have created, an online community platform. This again is a way for information sharing amongst members of the network, and we know that information sharing is more robust as more and more people use the network. So we are very pleased at this, and we have created specific communities, including one that is focused particularly on planning for agriculture. So we would encourage people to become members of the network. Did I say it was free? That's an important thing. And also for those of you who might be associated with public agencies, please know that the network is not an advocacy and lobbying network. So the network will not ever take positions on things. Again, it is intended as an educational one. So it should not be a concern for anybody in terms of that being a limitation if you are public official. And then the last one we just want to point out is that we are doing a monthly network newsletter. That one of the great things about this is that it is offering federal and state policy updates. We would welcome any, and I would say that we could expand this again because we're a new network. If there are interesting local, county, municipal policy updates that people think are really sort of trend setting and important to have others in the state or region or even nationally know about what's happening, we are happy to publicize things through this network news. So please know that the network is here to be a resource, and we hope that folks will sign up for it. And with that, I turn it back to Kara.
Great, thank you, Chris, so much. So we're going to wrap it up for today. I just wanted to thank all of our speakers again. You know, it's always a little bit on edge when you're trying to pull off a webinar and the time allowed, and there's so much more that we could do around this topic and discuss. And so this is just a starting point for AFT to work with all of you. We will be providing all of the attendees here with a resource list to help you plan for agriculture in your community. And so I wanted to thank you again, and we hope you all have a great day.